Amadeo and Ines for inviting me, and Raquel and everybody for helping with the organization. I also really enjoyed everyone's talks today, so thank you for that too. You have a handout, it's in your little packet. It just contains some of the longer quotations that I'm reading in case it's easier to follow along in print, and a photograph of a large family. Okay, I'll begin. To say that the iconic figures of the 19th century novel are individuals struggling to make their way in the world is merely to state the obvious. The century's classic genre, the Bildungsroman, traces a central character's development from an isolated childhood to a fully socialized adulthood. The Bildungsroman privileges singularity, the unique and often the only child. There is no one like Wilhelm Meister or Jane Eyre, and they are only grouped with other children in order to demonstrate this truth. So Wilhelm alone among his siblings appreciates the puppet show. Jane Eyre is the only reader at Gateshead. The Bildungsroman thus consolidates a particular model of liberal subjecthood, that of the irreplaceable individual. Writing in the early 20th century, Georg Simmel described the emergence of the modern individual at the beginning of the 19th century, not only from the rusty chains of guild, hereditary status, and church. This Simmel, like Ian Watt, argues was established in the 18th century. But further, the quest for independence continued to the point where individuals who had been rendered independent in this way wanted also to distinguish themselves from one another. What mattered now was no longer that one was a free individual as such, but that one was a particular, an irreplaceable individual. Simmel saw this conception of the irreplaceable individual crystallized in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, usually also considered the first Bildungsroman. Wilhelm Meister comes from a large family, but Goethe never tells us how many siblings he has. The significance of his siblings lies in being left behind, as the novel tracks its protagonist's development. Even in a classically populous Victorian Bildungsroman like Dickens' David Copperfield, which Marika discussed earlier, we watch the central characters grow up alone. David himself, Agnes Wickfield, Doris Spenlow, Uriah Heep, James Steerforth, and even the minor character Tommy Traddles are all only children. In this, their experiences would have been extremely unusual for the Victorian era. Far more typical of the period's demographic reality is the experience of Sophie, Traddles' patient fiancée in David Copperfield, who is, as Dickens repeatedly jokes, one of 10 down in Devonshire. What the historian Leonore Davidoff calls the long family, a family of numerous siblings stretching through decades, was standard for much of the 19th century. Davidoff writes, "In Britain, 1/3 of married women born in the early 1850s had at least 7 live births. 10 to 15% had 10 or more children, and these families contained 1/4 of all children." Unlike the only children in her generational cohort within David Copperfield, Sophie matches the actual demographic profile of most Victorians. As one of 10, it falls to her to educate her youngest sisters, humor her eldest, and tend to her invalid mother and another sister who has something the matter with her spine. The caretaking work at which Sophie excels prohibits her from the kind of individual progress accorded to the heroes of the Bildungsroman. Peter Brooks and Franco Moretti, among others, have shown that the Bildungsroman plot is organized around ambition. Sophie can't even leave her house. When she is finally allowed to marry Traddles, she brings multiple sisters with her to their lodgings. While Dickens' mocking tone implies that a large family is necessarily a ridiculous outlier, he himself was one of 8 and was the father of 10 children. Sophie's predicament might instead suggest why real Victorians, accustomed to the constant presence of siblings, might fantasize about the isolation and even the ostracism that bedevil the solitary heroes of Bildungsroman. But the Bildungsroman is not the only genre that narrates the development of youth. In this talk, I will examine the narrative mechanics of a very different genre, the large family chronicle. The large family chronicle promotes the needs of the group over those of the individual and values replaceability over irreplaceability. In doing so, the large family chronicle recasts the family not as background, but as centerpiece, not as antagonistic, but as protagonistic, thus exploring how far the concept of plot is compatible with sustained attention to multiple group members. And part of the problem, as I've discovered from reading many of these, is that plot is incompatible with many group members. So this is a sort of problem this genre is working at. How far can there be a plot with no central figure? And this is part of a larger project that I'm just working on that looks at what kinds of narratives are available at the level of the group rather than the individual that's so much associated with plot. And so I'm starting to think about the slow time of group institutions and thinking about narratives of institutions as chronicles rather than novels, starting with monastic chronicles of, medieval monastic chronicles of regions or monasteries, and moving into, in the British novel, moving into the chronicles of Margaret Oliphant and Anthony Trollope that are also series that track group institutions over time. My principal examples of the large family chronicle in today's talk, Charlotte Mary Young's The Daisy Chain from 1856, the story of the 11 May children, Louisa May Alcott's sequel to Little Women, Little Men, 1871, with 13 children being educated at Plumfield, and Frank Gilbreth Jr. and Ernestine Gilbreth Carey's Cheaper by the Dozen, a 1948 memoir about life with the 12 Gilbreth siblings, speak to a childhood desire quite distinct from the exceptionalism characteristic of the Bildungsroman. While Jane Eyre escapes Lowood Institution and the March family of Little Women recedes as Jo March's Bildung takes shape, large family chronicles maintain an effort to narrate the experience of being enmeshed with others. Large family chronicles even insist that the individual not be overvalued and that a flourishing group can function in the absence of any particular person. By moving away from the individual and toward a functional system composed of important but replaceable parts, the large family chronicle fosters a model of group flourishing that I will call brimfulness. I take the term from an American family chronicle, Margaret Sidney's 5 Little Peppers and How They Grew, published in 1881. And this is the first quote on your handout. In Sidney's book, the wealthy Jasper King befriends the 5 Little Peppers, a family of poor children crowded into a New England cottage. In spite of his wealth, Jasper envies them. "Oh, I should think you'd have real good time," said the boy enviously. "I haven't a single sister or brother." "Haven't you?" said Polly, looking at him in extreme pity. "Yes, we do have real fun," she added, answering his questioning look. "The house is just brimful sometimes, even if we are poor." The 5 Little Peppers have fun because there are 5 of them. You need a lot of children to create a brimful house, and certain childhood activities, theatricals, singing in parts, require numbers. The lonely Jasper does not rest until he has imported the entire family of Peppers and their mother into his own Manhattan residence in a desperate bid for this kind of brimfulness. To be brimful is to be full to the point of overflowing without actually overflowing. It suggests quantity without implying excess. Polly's qualification that the house is brimful even if we are poor acknowledges that brimfulness is a precarious image. It is a vision, an aesthetic and affective ideal that need not disguise negative affect or real danger. To be brimful is necessarily to be brimful against all odds. The account I've just given of the 5 Little Peppers might wrongly imply that Jasper is the hero of the novel and its sequels. The lonely only child is, of course, a common literary trope. But 5 Little Peppers and How They Grew, like the family chronicles of Charlotte Mary Young and Louisa May Alcott on which it was modeled, refuses to align narrative interest with a single protagonist, and instead searches for a narrative mode that accommodates the entire family group. In this, family chronicles forge a distinctive path through the history of the novel, where plot so often demands a hero. In their attention to the many, family chronicles tackle the issue of group representation in a much different way from the canonical novels that Alex Wallach discusses in The One versus the Many. The 5 Little Peppers have almost nothing in common with the 5 Bennett sisters, for instance, and Austen's Pride and Prejudice is one of Wallach's primary examples. And their narratives are equally dissimilar. Unlike Austen, writers like Young and Sidney avoid the supposed narrative imperative to sift the many down to the one, in a contest for the lion's share of what Wallach calls the novel's distributed attention. Wallach's examples emphasize competition. The Battle of the Iliad is a test of Achilles' physical and protagonistic dominance. The courtships at the heart of Pride and Prejudice take place in a less bloody, but no less ruthless arena, in which only one sister can wed the wealthy newcomer. And the striving of the parvenu in Balzac occurs in a world of capitalistic struggle where one can rise only at others' expense. And I really enjoyed Anna's paper about how even the parvenu and arrivistes come from families, but they leave them behind in the provinces. Recently, Frederick Jameson has employed Wallach's concept of a character system while moving away from the idea of a zero-sum game. Jameson instead identifies in the late 19th century novels of Pérez Galdós a deterioration of protagonicity, a movement of the putative heroes and heroines to the background, whose foreground is increasingly occupied by minor or secondary characters. But in Wallach's account, the family dynamic duplicates the characteristics of an asymmetrical society, and siblings, like all other groups of characters, struggle for attention from parents, the novelist, and the reader in a zero-sum game. Large family chronicles oppose this competitive picture of both family life and narrative dynamics. I want to underscore how distinctive this form is. Family chronicles differ from all three of the dominant narrative modes of the 19th century novel. With their emphasis on multiplicity, they are unlike the Bildungsroman, with its only child, on the one hand, and the courtship plot novel, with its one and only one love, on the other. But in spite of their populist dramatis personae, they are also unlike the classic Victorian multi-plot novel. Readers of a family chronicle never have the kind of perspective-shifting experience that Peter Garrett describes in the Victorian multi-plot novel, when, quote, the wide-ranging authorial narrative of the first two chapters of Bleak House narrows to the focus of Esther's first-person narrative, or when Middlemarch turns, quote, from the first 10 chapters focused on Dorothea to a multiple narrative in which her story becomes only one among several. In a family chronicle, the stage lights consistently remain on the family as a group, often focusing steadfastly on the family home as a fixed setting. Far from using marriage as a sign of Bildung or a reassuring narrative arc, family chronicles rarely employ marriage as a culminating event. In fact, the characters in family chronicles tend to be vehemently anti-marriage. As Jo March laments after her sister's wedding in Little Women, it is dreadful to break up families so. Once we begin noticing the narrative patterns of the large family chronicle, a large group of children seen as a group, a fixed setting, often the family home, a long swath of time recorded as a mere slice of a family's history, a tendency to revisit scenes and characters in sequels and series, we can see that while the large family chronicle is an experimental outlier in canonical 19th century literature, it constitutes an important strand of Anglo-American children's literature. The large family chronicle is referentially aware of its own separate tradition. Louisa May Alcott's Jo March is found crying over a Charlotte Young novel in Little Women, and that novel's Ernest March family certainly owes something to Young's May family in The Daisy Chain. The tradition that stretches from Young's family chronicles to Alcott's to Sidney's is continued in Frank Gilbreth Jr. and Ernestine Carey's comic memoir, Cheaper by the Dozen. And I'm very sorry that Marika is not here because she told me that she's 12th of 14 children, and she told me her father loves Cheaper by the Dozen, so I'm very interested in that. The 12 Gilbreth children are described as reading Five Little Peppers on several occasions, most notably in the hospital after yet another sibling has been born, when the children visit their mother every night, quote, to hold the new baby and listen to mother read the Five Little Peppers. My examples today include both novels and memoirs, but as you'll see, family chronicles operate at the border of fiction and nonfiction. Alcott's family chronicles draw on her own childhood, while Gilbreth and Carey's memoir is playfully novelistic. The Gilbreth's reading practice of consuming a few chapters of Five Little Peppers at a time is well suited to the narrative form of the family chronicle, with its potentially endless episodic construction and serial attention to multiple children. In fact, all of the texts I've mentioned are parts of series. Sequels and series are the generic correlative of a brimful house. Far from a zero-sum game, the series' open-endedness allows for unlimited expansion. There is always room for another character in a chronicle sequence. As Louis Mink and Hayden White discuss in the context of the philosophy of history, the chronicle is typically considered an unsophisticated narrative form. Mink distinguishes chronicles whose only ordering relation is logical conjunction, and then, from narratives, which contain indefinitely many ordering relations and indefinitely many ways of combining those relations. The chronicle's additive mode seems to most narrative theorists undeveloped, even childish. The Would-Be-Goods, E. Nesbit's 1902 revision of the Large Family Chronicle, offers an instantiation of the overlap between the chronicles and then structure and child logic. Nesbit has a character summarize the daisy chain, and this summary is on your handout. It's by Miss Charlotte M. Young, and it's about a family of poor motherless children who tried so hard to be good, and they were confirmed, and had a bazaar, and went to church at the minster, and one of them got married and wore black-watered silk and silver ornaments, so her baby died, and then she was sorry she had not been a good mother to it, and... As Nesbit suggests, by only concluding the summary when the breathless young fan is interrupted, once embarked on a chronicle, there is no end in sight. It seems possible, however, to consider the chronicle's paratactical logic as utopian rather than naive in its anti-competitive vision of plenty. After all, there is always room for another character in a chronicle sequence. I turn now to Charlotte Mary Young's The Daisy Chain, a novel that was both popular and influential, but which nonetheless is astoundingly different from most familiar 19th century fiction. In her preface to The Daisy Chain, Young apologetically notes that her novel requires a new generic label. It would beg to be considered merely as what it calls itself, a family chronicle, a domestic record of home events, large and small, during those years of early life when the character is chiefly formed, and as an endeavor to trace the efforts of those aspirations which are a part of every youthful nature. For those who may deem the story too long and the characters too numerous, the author can only beg their pardon for any tedium that they may have undergone before giving it up. It is not a promising beginning, it must be admitted. Young acknowledges ruefully, if perhaps slyly, that her novel may bore her readers, and even that they may give it up before the end. She seems surprisingly eager to write the ars poetica for a genre, the family chronicle as she calls it, noted for its lack of narrative structure, even while it is crowded with home events, large and small. Although The Daisy Chain, like a Bildungsroman, focuses specifically on those years of early life when the character is chiefly formed, in place of the single, striving figure at the heart of the Bildungsroman, the novel follows 11 children, all of whom must learn to temper their ambitions in the service of a higher good. The Daisy Chain, like all of Young's output, is devoted to spreading the values of the Anglican Church, as seen from her conservative Tractarian viewpoint. True, the focus of The Daisy Chain is often on Etheldred May, who, as an earnest, awkward, intelligent teenager, seems to be a good candidate for the heroine of a Bildungsroman, but the narrative turns again and again to each of the 11 siblings. Rather than singularity and ambition, the family chronicle presents numerous siblings, diffuse narrative attention, an episodic organization, and a moral that favors duty to others over individual aspiration. Of the dozens of novels Young wrote, the majority are family chronicles dealing with families of 10 or more children. Young established the genre's norms in family chronicles such as The Daisy Chain and its sequel, The Trial, both focusing on the 11 May siblings, and The Pillars of the House with 13 Underwood children, which also has a sequel. The size of Young's families was frequently noted by the many Victorian critics who praised her realism. One obituary reviewer marveled that Young can interest us in the everyday realism of English domestic life, paterfamilias carving the boiled beef for the family of 11 and the governess, yet every character distinct and real. As I've suggested, the demographics of Young's families are themselves an assertion of fidelity to reality. She was writing at the historical height of the Long family, at a moment after dramatic improvements in infant mortality rates and prior to the widespread availability of family planning. Young herself attributed her interest in writing family chronicles to her own unusually solitary childhood, punctuated by visits to a large family of cousins, the joy of which was sustained when she was alone by imagining the exploits of 10 boys and 11 girls living in an arbor in the garden. Althea Hayter describes the origin of Young's family chronicles as a combination of experience and longing. Basing herself on her own experience, she adopted a formula on which her imagination had dwelt ever since she was a child, and to which her strong power of observation of external events in her life produced valid evidence, the formula of personality development within the framework of a large family group. Hayter's biographical criticism is helpful in illuminating how wish fulfillment mediates in the large family chronicle between fiction and memoir. Nonetheless, Turning to the principal characters in the daisy chain, the children Young warned in her preface might be too numerous, it is clear that life in the crowded May family is no fantasy. Richard, Margaret, Flora, Norman, Ethelred, Harry, Mary, Tom, Blanche, Aubrey, and Gertrude May all must live together and share in their family's genteel but straitened circumstances. It is often uncomfortable to be part of a family of 11. The May's wealthy neighbor Meta Rivers, like Jasper King in The Five Little Peppers, an envious observer of the large family dynamic, is struck by the privations attendant on siblings in a large family, brought home for her in the fact that the girls have to share a room. Her governess remarks, "You are an only daughter, my dear, and a petted one. There are too many of them to make much of, as we do of our Meta." At times, Young contends with the real childhood fear of being minimized or displaced, the fear that there are too many Mays. When little Aubrey, for instance, is introduced, he isn't old enough to speak, but he already contemplates the new baby with distrust, considering his deposition from babyhood as a great injury. The form of the family chronicle tackles the tension between individual needs and group membership in a distinctive way. The comment about Aubrey's sense of injury is not used to introduce a character who will become the focus of a particular kind of developmental arc founded on his overlooked specialness. Instead, it is just one of a series of observations about the siblings, all of whom take a turn pulling focus in the larger narrative of the group. Although competition exists in Young's chronicles, within the family, at the school, at university, and in the larger world, the characters learn how to resist it. The daisy chain itself opens with family prayers. Significantly, the gospel was on taking the lowest place. As the children deduce, it is a lesson against ambition. Norman, the family's most academically gifted son, nearly makes himself ill with striving to take high honors at Oxford and finds himself in danger of losing his faith. He pulls up at the right time, however, and rejects academia, which he loves, in favor of missionary work in New Zealand, for which he's not at all cut out. For many 20th centuries, and even plenty of 19th century reviewers, Young's lessons against ambition seem excessively repressive. As Cutie Leavis sneered, Young suggests, "The most blessed life for a man is to give up the natural field for his abilities in order to become a South Seas missionary, and for a woman to renounce a possible husband in order to devote herself to her relatives." Leavis's critique makes plain how an apparent objection to Young's conventionalism is in fact often a response to Young's thwarting of narrative conventions. Norman isn't allowed to be the hero of a Bildungsroman, and Ethel isn't allowed to be the heroine of a marriage plot, thus frustrating not so much the character's desires as the reader's narrative expectations. But the daisy chain has something to offer in place of squashed hopes and dreams, and this is something that I'm calling brimfulness, an experience of joy only available from within an enveloping family. Brimfulness is the affective indication that the chronicle has achieved its aim of articulating the value of the group. The brimfulness of the May family greets the reader in the opening pages of the daisy chain. All 11 siblings make multiple appearances over the course of the lively first chapter. They are in motion, flying about the house, and rather than being simply introduced once and thereby fixed into a single category, they appear in multiple overlapping categories that cross age and gender divides. Ethel and her brother Norman, who in age came between her and Flora, read Shakespeare together. That division of the family collectively termed the boys, namely Harry, Mary, and Tom, scuffles on the floor. We learn that Flora, Mary, and Ethel share a room, Norman and Harry are grouped as the two school-age boys, and Richard is identified as Margaret's favorite brother. These groupings are dynamic. The family operates by necessity on a system of replacement that also runs counter to expectations of competition. When Harry joins the Navy, Tom takes his place at school. Flora's marriage alters the sleeping arrangements. Ethel was to succeed to the abode in Margaret's room, Blanche being promoted from the nursery to the old attic. When Norman decides against becoming a doctor, as his father had always wished, he thinks Tom will do just as well. "Tom will not stand in your place," Ethel declares, insisting on Norman's special worth, but Tom ends by becoming the local doctor that one of the May boys was always to have become, and so on. The family's mechanism of replacement could be viewed as dehumanizing, but Young praises it instead as a sign of the group's flourishing. A brimful house is at its best when these maneuvers are possible. The two major stress tests for the value of replaceability and brimfulness over irreplaceability and singularity are parental and erotic love. Young grapples with these challenges. Mrs. May attempts to convince her eldest daughter that the desire to be first in any way, even in love, is a dangerous self-seeking. When she advises Margaret that, quote, affection is round us like sunshine, and there is no use in measuring and comparing, we must give it out freely ourselves, hoping for nothing again. Her daughter challenges her. Oh, Mama, you don't mean that. Her mother clarifies, perhaps I should have said bargaining for nothing again, and continues her point by insisting that she doesn't expect to remain the children's principal love. It will be natural by and by that you should, some of you, love someone else better, and if I cared for being first, what should I do then? When Margaret continues to press her by pointing out, you are always sure of Papa, this demanding proponent of communal rather than individual love replies, in one way, yes, but how do I know how long? The only security is not to think of ourselves at all and not to fix our minds on any affection on earth. Immediately after this conversation, Mrs. May is killed in a carriage accident, and Margaret is maimed for life. This catastrophe propels the Chronicle forward by means of the very replacement Mrs. May had advocated. Margaret and her father divide the dead mother's duties, Margaret's sisters become her nurses, and everyone's responsibility ratchets up a notch. Dynamic replacement and communal rather than individual love raise the fear that the large family diminishes a parent's ability to care for any one child. Writing in 1949, George Orwell asserted that one great difference between the Victorians and ourselves was that in a family of 10 or 12, it was almost inevitable that one or two should die in infancy. And though these deaths were sad, of course, they were soon forgotten, as there were always more children coming along. This modernist view of the Victorians implies that individualism of a modern kind would be incompatible within the context of the large family system, where specialness is impractical or even tragically unthinkable. Dr. May himself seems to promote this view. When he packs his third son, Harry, off to the Navy, the father calmly observes, being one of many, 'tis nonsense to make a rout about parting with you. But Dr. May's gruff speech is really intended to reassure his son. If it is better for you, he adds, it is better for all of us. Harry's story demonstrates how the narrative form of the Chronicle expands rather than reduces individual attention. Harry may be one of many, but he is not a one versus the many. Replaceability is distinct from competition. Harry's departure opens up a place at the school for Tom, but Tom was not jockeying for that position. And even in absence, Harry's adventures are full of interest. All of his siblings, as well as his father and the reader, eagerly await news of his adventures, including a shipwreck, which partly functions to interrupt his sister Ethel's near-marriage plot, and a dramatic return, which turns the narrative away from Norman's understated discovery of his religious mission. It does seem that there should be too many Mays to make a fuss about any one of them, and yet Young does exactly this throughout her novel, attending to first one May and then another. At one point in the novel, the Mays gather in the backyard to blow bubbles with a bowl of soapsuds and some tobacco pipes. The efforts of all the Mays present are described, from little Daisy, who drawing the liquid into her mouth throws it away with a grimace and declares that she does not like bubbles, to grave Norman and Papa himself, both of whom participate. The details of bubbles bursting and bubbles floating and one bubble that goes up over the house are given with care, as is each child's separate effort. Young spreads narrative attention around throughout single paragraphs and even single sentences. Dr. May, for instance, wraps up his conversation with Harry by asking him to send for Richard to write to the schoolmaster about Tom's enrollment in school. Young commits herself to the narration of each child's development, bringing the youngest children into the fold of the narrative just as soon as they can toddle, and turning from one to another in a dazzling display of brimfulness. In the 20th century, large families became increasingly rare in both Britain and America, and elsewhere for that matter. Perhaps for this very reason, the large family chronicle persisted as a popular young adult genre. I turn now to a nostalgic air to Young's genre-establishing daisy chain, Frank Gilbreth Jr. and Ernestine Gilbreth Carey's best-selling comic memoir, Cheaper by the Dozen, which episodically recounts the amusing adventures of the American Gilbreth family, headed by Frank Gilbreth, a pioneering efficiency engineer, and his wife and partner, Lily Gilbreth, a trained psychologist. By following the large family chronicle into the 20th century, the form's power to transform the family into an institution becomes clear. While Young uses the family chronicle to give expression to a set of religious values that favor the group over the individual, imagining a brimful house in Christian terms, a cup that runneth over with joy, Gilbreth and Carey use the large family chronicle to demonstrate the scientific management principles of efficient group functioning. In the memoir, the Gilbreth children recount being subjected to a range of experimental, educational, and organizational gambits, including listening to language records as they soap themselves up with maximum efficiency in the bathtub, and competing for household chores on a low-bid contract system. The narrative reorganization of the family chronicle allows chroniclers to reframe the relationship of individuals to groups within an institutional framework that can include both struggle and fulfillment. We can follow their lead by taking seriously the power of an institution to support a given set of principles and to perpetuate itself and its mission through time by means of replaceability and adaptability. The reconception of the family as an institution is itself a preoccupation of Gilbreth and Carey's Cheaper by the Dozen. The efficiency engineering parents believed that what would work in the home would work in the factory, and what would work in the factory would work in the home. If by 1930, Helen Grierson was able to look back upon Young's novels as artifacts of the large families of the past, when Cheaper by the Dozen was published in 1948, it was certainly a case study in anachronism, as the Saturday Review of Literature titled its review. Even in the earlier years depicted in Gilbreth and Carey's comic memoir, the 1910s and 20s, a family of 12 children was an unusual sight, and the authors describe the stir they create whenever they travel en masse. Whenever the crowds gathered at some intersection where we were stopped by traffic, the inevitable question came sooner or later, "How do you feed all those kids, mister?" Dad would ponder for a minute, then rearing back so that those on the outskirts could hear, he'd say, as if he had just thought it up, "Well, they come cheaper by the dozen, you know." Unlike the daisy chain, then, Cheaper by the Dozen is both comic and nostalgic, but it shares the other features of the large family chronicle as Young developed it. Rather than narrowing its focus to one protagonist, Cheaper by the Dozen includes anecdotes that pertain to all of the children. Like the daisy chain, Cheaper by the Dozen makes use of numerous siblings, diffuse narrative attention, and an episodic organization to make the case for a moral that favors duty to others over individual aspiration. The memoir itself, the product of co-authors, is narrated in the first-person plural, a we that refers to all 12 children. This unusual narrative choice accords with the strikingly different approach to the group depicted in large family chronicles. Nonetheless, even the nostalgic tone of Cheaper by the Dozen doesn't suppress all evidence of the disadvantages of life in a large family, which is a constant negotiation between individual needs and the group's mission. A series of anecdotes about going for a family drive are structured around the problems of being one of many in a group. In spite of their father's dangerous driving, the children loved going on drives. For one thing, a drive meant a chance to be with Dad and Mother. If you were lucky, even to sit with them in the front seat. There were so many of us and so few of them that we never could see as much of them as we wanted. Every hour or so, we'd change places so as to give someone else a turn in the front seat with them. In spite of systems like this for distributing attention, as they drive, the children squabble. And it was on such occasions that Anne wished she were an only child. Anne is the eldest, and she's the most tasked with responsibility. The chapter centered on family drives acknowledged the competition for parental attention and even a wish to eliminate other siblings, but end with a euphoric vision of brimfulness, which is on your handout. As we'd roll along, we'd sing 3- and 4-part harmony with Mother and Dad joining in as soprano and bass. What do only children do with themselves, we'd think? Dad would lean back against the seat and cock his hat on the side of his head. Mother would snuggle up against him as if she were cold. The babies were asleep now. Sometimes Mother turned around between songs and said to us, "Right now is the happiest time in the world." And perhaps it was. Singing in harmony is precisely the kind of activity made possible by a large family organized on the principle of replaceability. The disciplinary function of Mr. Gilbreth's whistle, that's how he summons all his children, and a decade later, Captain Von Trapp's whistle in The Sound of Music, is the necessary precursor to the sensation of pure happiness produced when the children sing together as a group. This joy is not constant, it only crops up in moments, but it is repeated, as Gilbreth and Carey's iterative mode suggests. Competition and individual prowess are beside the point in these moments of brimfulness, which are only achieved by rejecting individualism in order to stay with the group. Frank Gilbreth's whistle emerges from his dedication to precision. He was a world-renowned efficiency expert, and his wife was his partner. They're starkly different parenting styles, although they seem to contrast a model of group functioning. The children say that the father was happy to raise only 12 children, whereas the mother felt that she raised 12 only children. So a model of group functioning as opposed to one of individualism are presented in the memoir as complementary. While, quote, mother saw her children as a dozen individuals, a dozen different personalities, who eventually would have to make their way separately in the world, Mr. Gilbreth's efficiency explicitly demands replaceability. Dad saw the children as an all-inclusive group to be brought up under one master plan that would be best for everybody. What was good for Anne, he believed, would be good for Ernestine, for Bill, for Jack. The combination of their parenting approaches yields the narrative structure of the family chronicle. With an efficiency appropriate to institutions, the family chronicle refuses to linger with Anne, turning instead to Ernestine, to Bill, to Jack. At the same time, each child is afforded more attention than could reasonably be expected. Mrs. Gilbreth's attentive love allowed each child to know he means something very special to her, not just as one of the group, but as an individual person who has his own special claim on her heart. Mother's letters home contained personal messages for each child. She could hardly wait to see Jack swim, and she was mighty proud he had learned. She certainly wouldn't forget Martha's bathing suit when she passed through Montclair. Ernestine shouldn't worry about missing her college boards, and so on. The paratactical structure of her letters emphasizes sequential attention to each child as a potentially endless series, even if it efficiently moves from child to child. The positive glow of the memoir's nostalgia even illuminates the family's sense of itself as an institution. Together, both Gilbreth parents believed that what would work in the home would work in the factory. The joke that provides the title of the memoir, that 12 children come cheaper by the dozen, itself underscores the practical concerns inevitable in a family structured around efficiency and economies of scale. Suits purchased for each of the boys are acquired in consultation with the younger brothers in anticipation of hand-me-downs. Bathroom time is strictly allotted. When one of the children becomes sick, Mr. Gilbreth declares, "We don't have time for such nonsense. There are too many of us. A sick person drags down the performance of the entire group." The factory logic at play here, in many respects, conflicts with the religious values espoused by Charlotte Young in her Victorian family chronicles. And yet their shared narrative form suggests that they favor the value of the family group, seen as an institution, over that of the individual. The mother-daughter scene that occurs early in the daisy chain between Mrs. May and Margaret is replayed in the sequel to Cheaper by the Dozen, Bells on Their Toes. Anne Gilbreth, like Margaret May, the family's eldest child, has fallen in love and wants to get married, but worries about how the family could do without her. She tells her mother, "I know you'll need me to help run the house until the younger children are grown." When her mother claims that she doesn't need her help, Anne is shocked. But it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be. Of course it would be right. Ernestine helps run the house now just as well as you used to, and Martha will do just as well as either of you, even better, I suspect, when Ernestine goes off to Smith this autumn. And you're sure you're not going to need me at home? It's a mistake to think of yourself as indispensable, said Mother. Like Mrs. May, Mrs. Gilbreth counsels against a wrongful sense of importance, but Mrs. Gilbreth uses the logic of industrial efficiency. The family business is efficiency engineering, after all, rather than religious precept. The two perspectives diverge on many points, but converge here in the insistence that the individual not be overvalued and that the group's functioning can be maintained without any particular person. Replaceability is essential to institutional continuity. This kind of communitarian value requires a different narrative form to sustain its logic. And I'm just going to end by glancing at one last chronicle. The family chronicles I've mentioned are continually expandable in one way. Babies are added to the nuclear brood in The Daisy Chain and Cheaper by the Dozen, and cousins are discovered in Five Little Peppers, but they retain a boundary around the family, even if they rewrite it in terms of institutionality. I'd like to conclude by turning to a suggestive revision of the family chronicle, Louisa May Alcott's Little Men, which takes the logic of the large family chronicle as an institutional narrative even further by augmenting and ultimately supplanting the nuclear family itself. In doing so, Little Men demonstrates that the chronicle form can be scaffolded up from a focus on the family to consider the functioning of larger groups. Little Men begins with a vision of Plumfield, the school Jo and her husband, Professor Bear, have established. We first see Plumfield from the perspective of a new boy, Nat, who has arrived as a prospective charity pupil. Plumfield is far from an oppressive institution, like Jane Eyre's Lowood. To Nat's longing eyes, the house seemed swarming with boys who were beguiling the rainy twilight with all sorts of amusements. Alcott enumerates the amusements in another opening set piece that establishes brimfulness, and this is quite a long handout on your quite a long quotation on your handout. I won't read it all, but you can glance at it. It starts, "There were boys everywhere, upstairs and downstairs and in the ladies' chamber apparently, for various open doors showed pleasant groups of big boys, little boys, and middle-sized boys in all stages of evening relaxation, not to say effervescence." This picture of plenty is increased by the fact that the numbers are imprecise, and in fact impossible, conveying the impression that there are more boys than we subsequently learn the house contains. I get a total, from close reading this passage, I get a total of a minimum of 19 children by adding up several, at least 3, discussing a cricket ground, 1 tall youth, 2 or 3 jumping, 1 little wag, a game of tag, which has to be at least 3, a game of marbles, at least 2, a game of checkers, 2, 1 boy reading, 1 girl singing, small boys, at least 3, sliding down the banisters. But in fact, at the story's opening, there are only 12 boys and 1 girl, Meg's daughter Daisy, who is not an official pupil. Plenty of children, but still not as many as appear to the lonely Nat as he feasts his eyes on the brimful house. Nat's arrival as a new boy seems to establish a familiar narrative arc. Most classic school stories, including Thomas Hughes' influential Tom Brown's School Days, are focalized through a new arrival who makes his way up through the grades while navigating moral, social, and athletic challenges. And after touring Plumfield with Nat, the first chapter concludes with him happily falling asleep as Mother Bear kissed her new boy and left him to dream happy dreams of life at Plumfield. But Little Men upsets many of the conventions of the school story, not least by soon abandoning Nat as a focalizing figure. The second chapter immediately takes leave of Nat in order to tell the readers something about the boys among whom he found himself when he woke up. Soon, a second and more difficult to integrate new boy, Dan, appears on the scene, and then a third new pupil appears, the tomboy Nan, whose adventures also anchor the novel for a few chapters. If Little Women increasingly narrows from the family to the individual, Little Men relentlessly moves on from every possible hero to the group itself. The novel ends in another image of brimfulness, a harvest song sung by everyone and concluded with a group hug. Plumfield's brimfulness is at its heart both institutional and familial. On Nat's first evening, he thinks that the place seemed more like a great family than a school, for the lads were sitting in a wide half circle round the fire, some on chairs, some on the rug, Daisy and Demi on the knees of Uncle Fritz, and Rob snugly stowed away at the back of his mother's easy chair. The 13 pupils at the school at the story's beginning include Professor Bear's 2 nephews, Joe's 2 nephews, and the Bear's own 2 children. Almost half really are members of the same family. The admitted pupils are folded into their midst and include rich boys and charity orphans. Joe and Fritz are Mother and Father Bear to them all. In The Years, Virginia Woolf has North Pargeter observe that parents are not interested in other people's children, only in their own property, their own flesh and blood, which they would protect with the unsheathed claws of the primeval swamp. How then can we be civilized? Alcott herself offers a gentler critique of this problem in Meg's reaction to her sister's plan to establish a school for boys. "It will be an immense care for Joe," said Meg, stroking the head of her one all-absorbing son. The bears seem strangely immune to the parental trap of absorption. Little Men imagines a way outside of the confines of flesh and blood by envisioning a school that envelops and expands on the family. In her recent book, Staying with the Trouble, the ecofeminist Donna Haraway proposes a slogan that North Pargeter and Joe March might be able to get behind: "Make kin, not babies." Haraway broadens the idea of kin by tracing its etymological history, emphasizing that kin is a wild category that all sorts of people do their best to domesticate. Making kin as oddkin rather than, or at least in addition to, godkin and genealogical and biogenetic family troubles important matters, like to whom one is actually responsible. What must be cut and what must be tied if multi-species flourishing on Earth, including human and other than human beings in kinship, are to have a chance? Haraway's question is an effort to widen the category of those to whom one is actually responsible. She doesn't seek to destroy all possible boundaries, but to expand them, pushing past immediate biological ties into concepts of kin that might include strangers and even other species. Little Men uses the form of the large family chronicle to advocate for this kind of expansion, and yet the novel acknowledges that this expansion carries real risks for the family itself. Joe and Fritz's elder son Rob is lost in the woods for a day when he joins an expedition with the school's older children. Both of his parents are occupied. And their younger son is described as, quote, "a frequent victim who was often rescued from real danger. Once he was shut into a closet for a dungeon and forgotten by the girls who ran off to some out-of-door game. Another time he was half drowned in the bathtub, playing to be a cunning little whale. And worst of all, he was cut down just in time after being hung up for a robber." If Little Men offers a fantasy of enmeshment in the group, it also grapples with the precariousness of that vision. This is the affective achievement of the brimfulness of the family chronicle, a genre that struggles to imagine connection as infinitely extendable rather than competitively limited. Telling a story about a group rather than an individual remains an almost intractable problem. Thus, the large family chronicle is a minority tradition within the otherwise inescapable individualism of the 19th century novel. But its formal negotiations help us see some of the possibilities intrinsic to anti-individual narration. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
We do have about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'd just like to point out that it's very curious that we started talking this morning about overcrowded cemeteries and Symposium talking about brimful houses as a narrative category and then also an emotional state. So I can't help but get the feeling of a full circle that we've made, in which abundance and scarceness seem to be two important coordinates associated with families. But this is something we want to pick up.
Yeah, it's a nice
debate, which starts now.
It's a nice question.
Thanks, Maia. That was such an interesting paper, and it's not really a fiction, a kind of fiction that I'm not familiar with. You know, I'm familiar with Oliphant's shorter fiction rather than her big novel, which of course have those limitations. And I thought you were going to talk about Trollope, and I'm sure other people might be asking about Trollope, but this is a small question, really. With the school novel, I suppose you can deal with that chronicle and then by giving it the framework of the school term. And it often ends, you know, as they're heading off for summer or something. But with some of these other ones you're talking about, like the young ones, you've got and then an episodic, what kinds of endings, do they have any closure?
Yeah. Closure is such an interesting question for Young's books in particular. I mean, because she's religious, that often provides a kind of framework. So at the daisy chain itself, the only thing that really structures it is that towards the beginning of the novel, the children think they want to build a church in a neighboring poor area that doesn't have one, and they actually do build a church by raising money, and over, the novel takes place over 15 years. It's a very, very long time frame. So there is a ceremony dedicating the church towards the end of the novel, but even that moment, which would seem really conclusive in a way, the character who had been the primary engine behind it almost doesn't go. Everybody is like, well, this isn't as important as we thought it was. So every moment and every marriage kind of happens behind closed doors, or there are a sequence of deaths that are all quite quickly handled. So many moments that would seem potentially conclusive aren't, in a strange way. I mean, since you mentioned Trollope, I am really interested in Trollope, and I think this project, however it takes shape, will have a Trollope chapter at least. But one of the things that I think is different about Trollope is that he does, in individual novels, get like a single hero or heroine and a very clear conclusion. But then within the series, the next novel displaces all of that. So Young kind of does that more rapid fire, but Trollope does that too, and is really interested in how, when you first meet, there are characters who are the center of one novel, and then you later meet them as just a brief mention in a chapter, and time has kind of moved on from them. So he achieves a similar kind of feeling, I think, with a different strategy.
Sort of and then
yeah.
over the whole series.
Which I think is the characteristic of the Chronicle, the idea that it could theoretically go on forever, and there are no obvious beginning or end point to it, that you could just pick any slice of time. Young has another novel called Scenes and Characters, and its subtitle is 18 Months at Beechcroft. And I've been thinking about that subtitle as sort of mapping the two coordinates of the Chronicle, that the 18 months, the way that's put, it almost seems like it could be any stretch of time, just like any 18 months, and in fact, that's the feel that novel gives you. But the at Beechcroft is so specific. I mean, this actually connects to Inesh's paper, but like the place has to be just in this house, and everything that's happening there, but it could be any amount of time, or any stretch of time.